Yes, I am going to talk about storytelling today, but I thought I should probably start by explaining what it is that I mean by a story. Because, you know, a lot of times people will see the title of one of my books or the lecture that I'm going to give, and they'll say, oh, I already know what you're going to tell me. You're going to tell me that if I've got a big speech or a presentation, I should kick it off with a joke or a little anecdote to kind of break the ice and lighten the mood. Now, that may be a good idea, but that's not at all the kind of storytelling that I'm talking about. I'm talking about the kind of storytelling that actually delivers your leadership message. Okay, so one of my favorite examples actually comes from a guy named Jason Zoller. Now, today, Jason is the Vice President of Consumer Research for a big consumer products company. But 20-some-odd years ago, he was a senior at the University of Central Florida. And one of his favorite professors told the class a story so compelling that Jason's been telling that story every year to his new hires in consumer research. And apparently what happened was, a few years earlier, the professor had broken the students up into groups of 4, 5, or 6 each, and each had a research project for the semester. But one of them had a more interesting project than all the others, and it was this. It was, how can we improve the jury deliberation process? All right, so imagine you were on this team. You would have probably done the same things that they did, right? They interviewed all the other judges in the jurisdiction. They interviewed prosecuting attorneys, defense attorneys, but mostly they interviewed former jurists, right? People who'd actually served on juries themselves. And they asked them all the same kind of questions that you probably would have asked them. You know, what was the trial about? How long did the trial last? What kind of information were they allowed to have in the jury room? They even asked them questions like, you know, how late did they make you work into the evening, and what kind of food did they feed you? It turned out, their conclusion was, at the end of the semester, that none of those things mattered. Their conclusion was that the only thing that mattered was the shape of the table in the jury room. They concluded that jury rooms that had rectangular tables, whoever sat at the head of the table, even if it wasn't the jury foreman, tended to dominate the conversation. You know, and so they concluded that a less than robust debate of the facts ensued, and perhaps a less than fair verdict was rendered. But in jury rooms that had round or oval tables, a more fair and egalitarian debate of the facts ensued, and therefore perhaps a more accurate verdict was rendered. So, end of the semester, they're very excited to make their big presentation to the head judge for two reasons. Right? One is that they really felt like they nailed it. Right? This was the one thing that can really improve the jury deliberation process. But the other reason they were so excited is because it was such an easy thing to fix. Right? I mean, imagine instead if their conclusion had been, well, the only way to improve the jury deliberation process would be to seat the jury with, more fair-minded, better educated, more critical thinking people or something. I mean, how do you do that? But swapping out a table is fast, cheap, and easy, right? So the judge was very excited for exactly the same two reasons. The judge immediately issues a decree. In all the courthouses in my jurisdiction, anywhere we've got any of those round tables, get rid of them. Okay? I didn't just misspeak. In direct contradiction to their recommendation, he said, get rid of the round tables and put in rectangular ones. Now, let me just ask you, why do you think he did that? Anybody, just shout it out. Right. Faster deliberation. Thank you. The judge's definition of an improved jury deliberation process wasn't a more fair or accurate one as they had assumed. It was a faster one. He wanted to reduce the backlog on his court docket. All right? Now, imagine you're one of those 5 or 6 students. How do you think they felt at that point in time? Right? Awful. I mean, the angst and remorse. I mean, imagine who these people are, right? These are young, 20-something, idealistic college seniors, right? Thinking that this project is their way to save the world, or at least make their little corner of the world in Central Florida a better place to be. But in their mind, what they had done is exactly the opposite. They made the world a worse place because of their project. Now, I'm sure they all got A's on their report card because they really did a good job on the project, but many of them regret to this day even taking part in that. Right? Now, Jason tells that story to his new hires for this reason, to impress upon them the importance of, it's critical to be clear on your objectives before you start your research project, not after. If you wait till after, you may be sorely disappointed in the result. Right? Now, he could just stand up in front of these fresh-faced new hires and say, well, in my 20 years in the business tells me that you should get very clear on your objectives before you start your project. Right? I mean, that's true, and that's good advice, but that would go in one ear and out the other because it just seems like common sense. But telling them that story, once you've heard that story, you can feel in your gut the angst and remorse and regret that those students must have felt, and you're far more likely to think about that every time you start your next project. Right? So the story is a far better way to communicate that lesson than just telling them what to do. And that's because Experience is always the best teacher, right? Those students learn that lesson better than anyone else. But a story is a close second. And everything else, I'm convinced, is a distant third in terms of its ability to impact somebody's thoughts, opinions, and behavior. Right? So that's the kind of storytelling that I'm talking about, a story that actually delivers your leadership message, not as some silly warm-up exercise. Okay? All right. Now, so recognize what stories are then. It's actually a narrative about something that happened to somebody. It's not a list of talking points or a sales pitch or something. It's actually a narrative about something that happened. Right? There's a time, a place, a main character. That main character has a goal. There's usually someone or something getting in the way of that goal, and there are events that transpire. Okay? So I mean a real story. Okay? Now, why do I think you should be telling stories? There's a lot of science and research that's gone into this. I'll give you my top 6 reasons right here. First of all, and most importantly, stories help people make better decisions. Right? A number of cognitive science research studies have shown that humans don't make the logical, rational decisions that we think we do. It turns out we make more subconscious, emotional decisions in one place in our brain, and then we justify those decisions logically and rationally in a different place in our brain a few nanoseconds later. Right? So we leave a decision thinking we've made it for these rational, logical reasons, but the truth is we made it for subconscious, emotional ones. And facts and data and logic can only speak to that one side of the brain. Stories can speak to both. And if you want to influence what people think or feel or do, in other words, leadership or sales or marketing or anything, anytime you want to influence people, you need to be talking to both parts of the brain, and storytelling does that better than just about anything else. All right, number 2, storytelling is timeless. Right? We've been telling stories since we've been scribbling pictures on cave walls. Right? It's the oldest form of communication known to man. All right, third, stories are demographic proof. I have yet to meet a demographic profile of audience who is immune to the effects of a good story. Now, a lot of people are immune to the effects of a bad story, and I'm one of them, and you might be too, but I'm talking about good stories here. It just seems to work on everyone. All right, number 4. Stories are contagious. You tell a good story and it will travel around your world, however big your world is. Right? I'll tell it to you, you'll tell it to her, she'll tell it to him. It travels. My guess is your policy memos don't do that. Right? Your emails probably stay in the inboxes and delete folders that they got to. Right? But you tell a great story and it just travels by word of mouth. And I think you want your leadership message to have that kind of quality. All right, number 5. Stories make things easier to remember. A number of studies have shown that facts are between 6 and 22 times more likely to be remembered if they're embedded in a story than if they're just given to people in a list. But you don't have to believe any of the studies because I'm going to prove it to you right now. And that is that all of you in this room sitting here right now listening to this know that by this time tomorrow, none of you are going to remember this list of 6 things. Right? It's okay. I'm not going to be insulted. Right, I've given this lecture 100 times, and every time I have to turn around and look at the list because it's just a list of 6 things. Right? But all of you sitting here right now know that by this time tomorrow, you will remember the story of the round and rectangular jury tables. Right? And next week, and next month, and a year from now, most of you in this room would be able to tell that story and get most of the facts right. But none of you are going to remember this list of 6 things. Right? That's the power of a good story. All right. And then last, stories inspire. Slides don't. When's the last time you heard somebody say, "Wow, you'll never believe the PowerPoint presentation I just saw"? Nobody says that. You won't say that at the end of this one either. But you will say that at the end of a good story. Right? And hopefully you'll hear some of those today as well. So there's probably dozens of other reasons. Those are my top 6. And if you're not convinced, I assume in the next few minutes you will be. All right. When should you be telling stories? Right? Because I'm not such a zealot of storytelling that I think you should walk around all day long telling stories and nothing else. Right? There are times for stories and times not for stories. Right? And as doing the research that I put into the books and the lectures and the training that I give, I've interviewed probably 300 or so CEOs, leaders, executives, vice presidents at companies all over the world, 25 countries around the world, dozens of different industries, hundreds of companies. And in each of these interviews, I'm asking them, what situation are you in when you're telling a story? What story did you tell? And did it work? Right? And so each person I interviewed gave me probably 8 to 12 different stories, so do the math. I've literally documented 3,000 or so individual leadership and business stories. Now what that's allowed me to do is reverse engineer my way into what works and what doesn't work in terms of business storytelling, but it's also taught me when great leaders are telling stories. And it turns out it's in far more situations than I had imagined previously. So it's things like when you need to set a vision for the future for the organization, when you need to lead change in the organization, when you need to make a recommendation to the boss or the executive committee, the decision makers that really sticks, when you need to get people to be more collaborative on your team or to be more creative or to just teach people how to do their jobs or help people find passion for their work again. Anytime you're trying to do what you might consider leadership, leading people, stories can help you. Now, if you're trying to manage processes and things and decisions, it's not the best tool, but when you're leading people, it's a great tool. Now, I did a whole other set of research just for sales and marketing type folks, where I interviewed salespeople and professional buyers. And I found a whole different set of stories that great salespeople are telling, all the way from throughout the entire sales process, from the moment they meet somebody to building rapport, to the sales pitch itself, to resolving objections, to closing the sale, even stories that they tell after the sale to build loyalty. So there's a whole set of stories that no matter what you do, you probably do your job better if you use some of these stories than if you didn't. Okay, I want to give you a couple of more examples of storytelling just to show you the diversity of uses of these stories. And I wanted to pick some that I thought would be highly relevant to this group. So I think everybody in this room is in the customer service business, right? In some way. Right? You're either the one planning the meetings for your either external or internal customers, or you're one of the venues or the suppliers that works with these meeting planners, but all of you have customers that you need to keep happy, right? So customer service is one of the areas where storytelling is a fabulous tool. I'll give you one of my favorite examples here. And this one comes from a guy named Sterling Price. Now, 35 years ago, in the early 1980s, Sterling Price was a 17-year-old kid working at a Pizza Hut in Springdale, Arkansas. And he actually was out at the cash register at the moment. Right before closing time, an elderly woman came in, and she ordered a meatball sandwich. Okay, it's Pizza Hut, right? So, the guy, he has to laugh, and he says, look, this is Pizza Hut, right? We don't have meatball sandwiches. She didn't think that was so funny, though. In fact, she was very insistent on getting a meatball sandwich, and he said she was visibly distraught, like on the verge of tears. And she explained herself a little bit. She said, I know it's Pizza Hut, but, my husband's been really sick, and he's lost his appetite, and I'm just trying to get him to eat something, and meatball sandwich is his favorite food, and I've been to every other restaurant in this little bitty town, and nobody's got one, and you're the last place I'm going to go before I go home empty-handed. And, of course, that, made an impression on him, and he said, well, look, we don't sell meatball sandwiches, but we do have meatballs because we sell spaghetti and meatballs. I've got bread, I've got mozzarella cheese, and obviously we have tomato paste. If I just kind of put all that together and maybe charged you, $4 for it, would that be good enough? And she said, oh, that'd be fabulous, thank you. So he makes her this ad hoc meatball sandwich and sends her on her way. And of course doesn't think a thing else of it until a few days later when she called him on the phone. Or she called the store and asked for him by name. And he gets on the phone and she says, hey, I'm the lady that you sold the meatball sandwich to, and I just really wanted to thank you. My husband did eat it. It was the most complete and satisfying meal that he's had in weeks, and I really can't thank you enough, but I also thought that I owed you a little bit more of an explanation for why I was so upset and emotional the other night. She said, he's not just been sick, but he was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer 6 months ago, which he's been battling ever since, and his loss of an appetite was the least of this guy's unpleasant symptoms. But it's the only one that she could ever provide any comfort for. So it was very important to her that he helped her meet that need, because it's, like I said, the only one that she could help him with. And she finished by saying, like I said, he did enjoy it. It was his, the last full meal that he had, but he passed away last night. And that was his last meal. And it was so important to me, so I really want to thank you. Now, of course, at that point, she's in tears, and he's in tears on the phone, probably very embarrassed, 17-year-old kid in the story, Now, here's the travesty in this story, other than the human travesty that this man lost his life. The business travesty is that happened 35-ish years ago. The first time that story was ever written down or told to somebody outside the 4 walls of that Pizza Hut in Springdale, Arkansas, was 5 years ago when my first book was published. Okay? For 29, 30 years, that story went untold. Okay? To me, that's like a cardinal sin of leadership. Imagine what good that story could have done, for Pizza Hut, employees, tens of thousands of them all over the world, as a lesson in what great customer service looks like, or an external relations campaign, or a PR campaign, or an advertising campaign. It could have been used for so many purposes, and it never was because nobody saw the value in it, because Well, it's just a story. No data, no facts, no numbers. It's just a story. Okay. There's no such thing as just a story. Right? In fact, your job as leaders is to be capturing great stories and using them to help people see your vision or teach them customer service or get them to be the kind of employees or customers that you want to have. All right? Okay, another one that I think will be relevant to this group, and I call it a problem story. This is a story that illustrates the quintessential problem that your product or service solves. Right? And you tell it so that people can recognize, oh yeah, I've got that problem, or I could have that problem. I definitely need to be doing business with you. Right? So in fact, my favorite example of this one comes from a guy named Kevin Moulton who worked for a company. He was in sales, worked for a company that did internet security protocol systems, which is a mouthful for basically they write the programming so that when you buy something online or get money out of an ATM, nobody steals your credit card. Right? Now, he calls on banks, and so in all of his sales calls, he always has this whole sales pitch, but he almost always tells them about a summer where he made a trip right here to Las Vegas. He was at a sales convention, and you know how these conventions go, right? You're at one right now. You know, you go to the convention during the day, you go to dinner after, and you're in Vegas, so you hit the casinos, right? So here he was at the casinos, and he says, you know, I was losing some, then I was winning some, then I was losing some, then I was losing more, then I was losing more. Well, at some point, he got tapped out of cash. He went to the machine, put his card in, transaction denied. Try it again. Transaction denied. He said, I know what's going on. I live in New Jersey. All of a sudden, I'm 2,000 or 3,000 miles away in Las Vegas, Nevada. It's the middle of the night, and I'm trying to get a ridiculous amount of money out of a cash machine. Right? They think somebody stole my credit card, and they're just looking out for me. And he said, I don't mind that. I want my bank to look out for me that way. He did have a problem, though, with what they did about it. He said, they called my wife in New Jersey at 4 o'clock in the morning, right? And can you imagine what that half of the phone call sounded like? Well, I'm sorry to wake you up, Mrs. Moulton, but your husband's in Las Vegas at a casino trying to get a boatload of cash out of a machine. Do you approve of this transaction? You know? He said, she wouldn't talk to me for a week, right? He said, they did not remain my credit card company for very long, right? Now, he can end that conversation, that story in this banker's office by saying, this kind of thing probably happens to your customers all the time, and you don't even know it. So if they had our company write their security protocol system, we would have done something smarter, like sent a security question or a text to my cell phone number, which they had, by the way, and didn't use. So he said we would have done something far smarter. We want to keep your customers happy and able to do legitimate business with you while we're protecting you and them. Okay, so. Now, again, he could have just whipped out some kind of statistics like, well, our studies show that 37.3% of your clients or your customers are slightly to moderately dissatisfied with their interactions with your banking institutions. Right? Now, if he's got that kind of data, sure, he should use it, but the story is far more compelling because the audience can see in their mind's eye the problem and how big of a human problem that is. Right? Okay. All right, now I want to shift now to how, in the time I've got left. How do you craft these stories yourself? So the first and most important thing is choosing the right story to tell. Because I'm not talking about just making stories up. These are real stories about real things that happen to real people. So when you're going to tell a story, the first decision is, what story am I going to tell? So here's how to do that. Now, always start with the end in mind. The first thing you have to ask yourself is, what do I want my audience to think or feel or do after hearing my story that they weren't going to do before? Right? That's your communication objective. Once you have that articulated clearly in mind, then the three most effective places to look for a story is a success or a failure or a moment of clarity around that thing that you want them to think, feel, or do. Okay? And you've seen examples of some of those already. So a success, like the meatball sandwich story, is a success story about somebody at Pizza Hut who successfully handled a difficult customer service situation. Right? We obviously learn from our successes. A failure, though, you heard a couple of those. So the jury table story and the ATM in Las Vegas story obviously were dismal failures, on the part of the people involved, the companies involved. People learn more from our failures than we do our successes. So failures make great stories, all right? The last one, though, is a moment of clarity. So that's basically the moment, whenever you learned this lesson the first time yourself, it obviously worked on you. Well, tell somebody about what happened that taught you that lesson, and they will learn the lesson the same way you did, because you're telling them the story about when you learned it. All right, so those are the three most effective places to look for a story: a success, failure, a moment of clarity around the thing you want them to do. All right? Okay, now, some other tips on telling stories. Structure, one of the most important things. Stories have a structure. All right, now I've tried a number of different ways to communicate with people about what the structure of a well-told business story is. And it's different than a romance novel or a movie or whatever. Yes, those are stories as well, but when you're telling a business or a leadership or a sales and marketing story, you don't have 2 hours in a movie theater, right? You don't have 250 pages in a book. You know, you've got about 2 to 3 minutes to tell a story. Leadership stories tend to be about 4 minutes. Sales and marketing stories tend to be about 2 minutes. So you don't have time for, you know, a really long, you know, process that George Lucas might use in a movie. You've got to have something short. So really there's four steps: the context, the challenge, the conflict, and the resolution. Now you need to give, you know, there's a hook at the beginning that you need to deliver to get them interested, and there's, you know, since it's a business story, you need to have a lesson or recommended action at the end. But the story itself is really just those 4 parts. But what I found easier for people to wrap their minds around is, what are the questions my story needs to answer? So this is them. And if you're interested, I can find a way to get you, you know, this list so you don't have to madly take notes. But here are the questions, the 8 questions your story needs to answer and the order in which you need to answer them. 1, why should I listen to the story? If you don't answer that in the first 10 seconds, your audience might not. They might mentally, physically, or emotionally walk away from your story. All right? Why should I listen to the story? Okay, then you're into the real storytelling. Where and when did it happen? Who's the main character and what did they want? What was the problem or opportunity they ran into? What did they do about it? And how did it turn out in the end? Right? Those are the logical, you know, progression of a basic story. But then when you're done, you've got to answer those last 2 questions. What did you learn from it? And what should I do now? Okay? So I'm going to give you a little bit of detail on some of these. And I'm going to start with the first one, especially how not to do it, because I see this done all the time. In fact, it's some of the most common mistakes I see in storytelling. That first question, you know, why should I listen to the story? Or basically, how do I kick off my story? The 2 worst ways to do it, right? Don't do this. Never apologize or ask permission to tell a leadership story, to tell a business story. Right? And you've seen this happen all the time. You'll be in a meeting, you know, 10 people around a conference table in a room, and somebody will raise their hand and say, I'm sorry to interrupt, but can I just tell a quick story? I promise, it'll just take a minute. Right? That happens all the time. Now, what do you think that communicates to the rest of the people in the room about how important that person thinks the story is? Right? Not very, right? Because they're already apologizing and asking permission to tell it. You know, so if you don't think your story is as important or more important than what was going to be said anyway, don't tell it, right? Just get back to the bullet points on slide number 72. But if you do think your story is important, then just tell it, right? Leaders don't ask permission to lead. They just lead, right? Never ask permission or apologize for telling a leadership story, okay? The way to do it instead is what I call with a hook. It's literally 1 sentence or less that lets the audience know that if they will listen to you for the next 3 minutes, you're going to tell them something that's important to them, not to you, to them. So for example, you might just say, gosh, you know, I think the best example of that I've seen was, and now you're telling a story. Or, wow, that's a tough problem. Let me tell you what I did last year when I ran into that same problem. And now you're telling a story, right? No apology, no asking permission. You don't even tell them you're going to tell them a story. And just tell the story, all right? Okay, so let me skip to the middle part, because that's an important part of the storytelling process. In fact, the most important part, the conflict. This is the struggle. This is the heart and the soul of storytelling. This is where the hero actually does battle with the villain, okay? The audience needs to see a struggle. And in fact, to illustrate how important the struggle is, I want to show you a short video that's actually a television commercial. I think it's 2 minutes long, and I want you to, as you're watching it, don't think of it as a television commercial. Think of it as a story, a 2-minute story, which is about how long they should be, remember. And ask yourself, how much of this 120 seconds is the struggle, the conflict in the story? All right, can we show this first video, please?
Evening.
Evening.
May I ring that up for you?
Yes, please.
Have a good evening.
Repeat after me. A.
A.
B.
B.
And C.
C.
A, B, C, D, E, F, G.
No, not good. Not good.
Just the sounds that words make.
Cat, dog,
Calamari.
trash, on the beach.
Good, good.
Farm, fresh. sun and I mowed the grass.
What's the gold star? Gold star. Unbelievable.
Dad,
Hey, Tubbs, I read your book.
you read my book. Barman, give that man a belt.
The main character in that obviously is the man, and he's obviously got a problem, right? He can't read. And it turns out he's got a really good reason to learn to read. Turns out his son wrote a book. Okay? But the problem that he couldn't read, that's not the conflict or the struggle. The struggle in the story was learning to read, right? The problem or opportunity that he ran into was son wrote a book, can't read. The struggle, the conflict was learning. Learning to read is hard, especially for an adult, right? Now, out of that whole 2 minutes, how long do you think was him learning to read? Anybody? Take a guess. What's that? Most of it. It's like 80%, right? Now, this is a little bit of an extreme example, but it's not uncommon for 50 to 60% of a story to be answering this one question out of the 8. What did the main character do about the problem? The action, the conflict, the struggle, right? So this is the most important part of storytelling. You can imagine what this story would have been like if they hadn't spent much time on the struggle. It just wouldn't have been an interesting, compelling story. Oh, his son wrote a book, so he went to learn to read. That's cool. The struggle is what makes a story interesting. Okay, now, let me skip then, to the resolution. This is the end of the story, right? This is where you wrap it up and tell, how it turned out, did the hero win or lose, etc. But here's the problem a lot of people run into. It's how do I know when to stop? Stop telling the story, right? And this is where you get into trouble. You got a great 3-minute story and you turn it into an awful 15-minute story, right? How do you know when to shut up, okay? So here's my test. You can stop talking when the audience knows how to feel about what happened in the story. Not when they know what to think, because you're going to cover that next in what was the lesson and recommended action. But once they know how to emotionally process what happened, that's when you know you've told enough. And I want to give you an illustration of that, and it's another video. And as we're queuing this up, I'm realizing that I think all 3 of the videos I'm going to show you today are for alcohol. So I don't know what that says about me, but man, you are in the right place to take advantage of this. So let's watch this second one.
choices we make reveal the true nature of our character.
All right, so the main character in this story is obviously the woman who owns the bar, runs the bar. She's obviously waiting for somebody to come home. You find out at the end that it's this guy, but the only thing you really know about him is that he's obviously been away in the military. But what else do you know about him? Is that her husband? Her brother? Father? Ex-boyfriend? Regular at the bar? You don't know. But are you happy that he's home? Yeah. And that's why they can end the story. The audience knows how to feel about what happened. Right? Fade to black. Now, they could obviously continue that story and explain the very interesting and complicated relationship, the on-again, off-again nature of their relationship, right? And that would be interesting, but that's more than you need, right? As soon as the audience knows how to feel about what happens, that's when you can safely end your story. Okay, now, so you're technically done with the story. Now you're transitioning out of the story into trying to get some business done with the story, right? So the three most important things you can do after telling a story, two of them include explain the lesson and the recommended action, but the first one is the most important. Just listen. All right, presumably you're having a conversation with someone, right? It's a requirement to let them talk at some point, okay? This is the time to do it. You've just finished telling a story, take a breath and just listen, right? Find out what they thought about the story, right? And I don't mean just did they like it or not, but find out what did they learn from it and what are they going to do differently now that they've heard it. Because if they say they learned the lesson you wanted them to learn and they're going to go do what you wanted them to do, great, you're done. Right? It's far better for the audience, whoever you're talking to come to that conclusion themselves than for you to tell them what to go do. Right? Human beings are far more motivated to pursue their own ideas than they are your ideas. And that's one of the benefits of storytelling, is that it inspires people to do something on their own accord as opposed to just be bossed around. So in fact, if you were going to just boss them around and tell them what to do, you shouldn't even bother telling them a story. Just boss them around. But this will work far better. Okay? All right. Now, a couple of more thoughts before I go. One, and we could, if I had a day with you, I'd love to talk to you about emotion and how long the story should be and the details to include in them, but I just have time for the most important ones. And one of them, I think, is the element of surprise. All right, so it's probably no surprise to you that the element of surprise is an important component of the books you read, the novels that you read, or the movies that you watch, because it's highly entertaining to have surprises. But there's a practical reason to include them in business stories, and that is that it literally makes your story more effective for two reasons. One is if you have the surprise at the beginning, it gets your audience to pay attention and stop thinking about whatever else they were thinking about. But at the end, it's even more important, because it literally gets the audience to remember the lesson in the story better. And that's because a surprise releases a little bit of adrenaline in the system of the person being surprised, and that cognitive research tells us that that actually makes the memory consolidation process, which is what psychologists call the memorizing function of the brain, makes it more effective. So a surprise ending actually plays a practical role in your storytelling. And there's a remarkably simple way to put a surprise ending at the end of almost any story, even the ones that you think don't have a surprise ending. And I'm just going to illustrate that for you, but I'll show you how that's done. So young boy named James, 9 years old. He's in the kitchen with his mom and his mom's sister. While mom and auntie are sitting at the table having a cup of tea, James is standing at the stove watching the tea kettle boil. And he's just fascinated with it, right? He's watching the steam come out the top, and he's got a spoon, and he holds it up there for the jet of steam is running into the spoon, and it's condensing into little drops of water and trickling down the spoon, dropping into a cup. And he's just watching this cycle go over and over and over again, just fascinated with it. Well, eventually his mother just barks at him. She's like, James, go do your homework, read a book, ride your bike. Aren't you ashamed of yourself just wasting your time like this? Well, fortunately, young James was undaunted by his mother's admonition, because 20 years later, at the age of 29, and in the year 1765, James Watt reinvented the steam engine, ushering in the Industrial Revolution that we, of course, all benefit from today, and all based on a fascination with steam that he developed at the age of 9 in his mother's kitchen. All right? Now, the first time I read that story, it was in a book titled James Watt, written by Andrew Carnegie in 1905. Right? So it was a biography of James Watt, inventor of the steam engine. So it was, of course, no surprise to me that the story in chapter 1 about 9-year-old James was about James Watt. But to you, unless you're a history buff, it was a surprise. And why? Because I didn't tell you his last name. Right? I took one vital piece of information that belonged at the beginning of the story, who's the main character, right? And I didn't give it to you until the end of the story. Right? Presto, surprise ending. It's that simple. You can create a surprise ending in almost any story that way. And I'll give you another. Here's my final beer ad. You guys are going to be so thirsty at the end of this. But I want you to watch this. Again, don't think of it as an ad, but as a story, and see how they created a surprise ending in the story.
Tell dedication, loyalty,
Getting better at this, yeah. Next week, buddy.
friendship. The choices we make reveal the true nature of our character.
All right, now, if this was a true story, and let's say you knew these guys and you wanted to tell somebody about it because you thought it was so cool, that's not the way you'd normally tell the story. Right? You'd say, oh, hey, a buddy of mine named Dave. So one of his friends was in a car accident a couple years ago, and he's in a wheelchair now. But they used to play basketball every Thursday afternoon. Well, now they go, every Thursday afternoon, they go rent wheelchairs, and they meet him at the gym, and they play ball just like they used to. Isn't that awesome? Right? I mean, that's basically the way you'd tell the story. But that's not the way they told the story. They told it basically that way, except for one thing. They didn't tell you that 5 out of those 6 guys didn't need to be in a wheelchair. You didn't find that out until the end when 5 out of the 6 guys stood up and one of them didn't. They took something that belonged at the beginning of the story naturally, and they didn't give it to you until the end of the story. Right? Presto, surprise ending. You can do it with almost any story. All right, so my last thought for you is that I want you to understand that the power of storytelling is so great that it's not just good for work. Right? It actually can make an enormous difference at home in your personal life. And I want to give you an example of that just because it happened to me personally. So back 5.5 years ago, I was struggling with the most difficult career decision of my life. I'd spent 20 years at Procter & Gamble, so I was in my mid-40s at the time, so too young to retire, but still had a couple of kids to get through college. But I knew what I really wanted to do with the rest of my career. And it was to be an author and a speaker, and quite frankly, do exactly what I'm doing right now today. But again, I was in the middle of my career and too young to retire and had some bills to pay. And a job like this, in case you haven't noticed, does not come with a steady corporate paycheck and benefits and vacation, right? You're only as good as your last book and your last speech. So it was a big risk, and I didn't know if I was brave enough to take that step. So I figure you're never too old to learn from somebody older and wiser. So I wrote my dad a letter, and when I say wrote my dad a letter, I literally mean wrote my dad a letter. Okay, so he was 80 years old at the time and hard of hearing, so I couldn't talk to him on the phone anymore. And he's 80, so he doesn't do computers, so I literally have to write him letters. So I wrote him a letter, and I told him basically what I just told you and asked him for advice. And then I waited for 2 weeks for the Pony Express to come back. And I knew what he was going to tell me one of two things, right? He's either going to say, oh, son, you should just quit your job, pursue your dream. I know you can do it. I have faith in you, right? Good dad. Or he was going to say, are you nuts? Why would you quit your day job now? Just keep your head down, put in a few more years, retire easy, and then go pursue all this nonsense or, important stuff, whatever, right? But he didn't do either of those two things. In the letter, all he did was tell me a story about himself that I'd never heard before, and neither had any of my siblings. He said, when I was 5 years old, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with my life. He said, I wanted to be a singer, like Frank Sinatra or Tony Bennett. He was 80, right? That's his genre. And he said, I knew that for sure the first day of the first grade. That first day, the teacher asked, if any of the students had any special talent, like, dancing or magic tricks or something. And he said, I raised my hand and I said that I can sing. This despite the fact that he'd never sung in front of anybody, other than his mom in the kitchen before. And so what do you think the teacher did when he said that? Right, like any good teacher would do. Well, Bobby, stand up and sing us a song then, right? So right there, 5-year-old Bobby stood up and he belted out his favorite song, a cappella, right in front of the teacher and the students. And he said, I nailed it. I got all the words right, all the melody right. I was so happy, so proud of myself. And he said, the teacher and the other students stood up and they applauded me. Right? My first performance, and I got a standing ovation. He said, that's when I knew this is what I was destined to do with my life. And the letter went on to say, but that unfortunately turned out not just to be the first time that I ever sang in front of an audience. It turned out to be the last time that I ever sang in front of an audience. And he said, life just got in the way. He said, but the truth is, I just never had the courage to pursue it. Although I think I could have done a really good job. I just never had the courage to pursue it. And he said, someday, son, you're going to wake up and you're going to be 80 years old like me, and it's going to be too late. Now, as if that wasn't enough, and believe me, it was, he closed the letter with these words. He said, I'd love to see you achieve your dream, but that doesn't mean in your lifetime, son. That means in mine. And I just, oh my God, tick-tock, the guy's 80, right? I mean, like, what kind of pressure is he putting on me? So, no kidding, 2 days later, I walked into my boss's office and I quit my 20-year career to pursue this dream. And it absolutely was the best decision I ever made, and I absolutely would not have made that decision that soon had it not been for my dad's story that I'd never heard before. Okay? Now, I learned something valuable on that day, and I hope that you do as well, and that is that if we were the only ones who suffered if we failed to pursue our dream, I guess it'd be okay just to walk around not pursuing our dreams. But it turns out that's not the case, is it? It turns out there are other people who desperately want to see you achieve your dream, whether that's a spouse or a parent or a child or a sibling or a friend or coworker. So if you won't do it for your benefit, do it for them. It turns out you'll make two people happy in the process. Thanks for your time today and enjoy the show.